I worked for a private investigations firm for almost 12 years, and most of our cases were exactly what you'd expect them to be. Insurance fraud, missing spouses, business partners skimming money, the occasional runaway teenager, but every now and then we'd get something really ugly, but never anything that none of us couldn't handle. Then we get a call from a woman whose son had been found dead on the balcony of his apartment inside this small border town. According to local authorities, it was a suicide, open and shut, gun in his hand, single gunshot wound, no signs of any kind of forced entry, but his mother wasn't buying it. She came into our office carrying this grocery bag full of photographs, receipts, and newspaper clippings. She looked exhausted, and not the kind of tired that you fix with sleep either, but just grief-stricken. Her son had owned a bar with one of his best friends. They'd grown up together, started a business together, and built it up from nothing. By all accounts, the victim was a hardworking guy, reliable, professional, the kind of person who answered calls at 3 a.m. when something needed done. His partner, however, was different. The deeper we dug, the more rumors we heard. Drug shipments moving through the bar, cartel money being washed through cash transactions, deliveries arriving after closing hours, employees who quit suddenly and refused to discuss why they did. According to several sources, the victim had discovered what his partner was doing and confronted him. A week later, he was dead. My boss assigned me one of our investigators to travel down there, and I'll call him Mike. Mike had worked some rough cases over the years. Former law enforcement, smart, a very calm guy. He could collect information covertly, but also handle himself if anything went south. The first couple of days went smoothly, then things immediately started getting really weird. He'd call every evening to give me updates. At first, it was very routine. Witness interviews, financial records, bar employees. Then he starts mentioning vehicles. The same white pickup was parked outside his motel 3 nights in a row. The same black SUV would show up near every single location that he visited. One afternoon, he interviewed a former bartender who agreed to talk only if they met in a church parking lot. Halfway through the conversation, the bartender spotted something across the street and immediately shut down. He gets into his car and leaves without another word. Mike followed him for a few blocks before the bartender called and told him to never contact him again. That night, my boss got his first phone call. Not the office line, but his personal cell. A male voice calmly letting him know the rub.
You need to leave this one alone. Sending any more investigators down here will get them killed, and my boys would love to collect their heads.
Then the caller hung up. My boss assumed it was a prank, but the next night, another call came. Same voice, same message, to back the fuck off and go back to wherever it is you came from. By the end of the week, the calls were coming in at all hours. Sometimes nobody spoke, sometimes there was only breathing. Once, somebody recited Mike's motel room number before disconnecting, and that obviously got our attention. Mike wasn't told immediately, we didn't want him distracted. Then he called us with news of his own. Somebody had entered his room while he was gone. Nothing was stolen or damaged, but every file that he collected had been spread across the bed. Photographs, notes, witness statements, laid out neatly, all the cards on the table. The manager of the motel claimed that nobody had accessed the room. Mike checked out within the hour and then moved to another motel across town. The next morning, a folded newspaper was sitting on the hood of his rental car. Inside was a photograph of the victim. Across the face, somebody had written a single word: suicide. Mike called from a gas station outside of town. He was quiet but not fearful. Wasn't panicked at all, at least not that I could tell. He was just convinced that he was being watched. My boss made the decision that afternoon that the case was over. We weren't law enforcement. We didn't have tactical teams or protective details. We aren't going to risk somebody's life trying to prove a murder that local authorities had already seemed very uninterested in pursuing. Every note, every interview, every financial record that we collected was packaged and handed over to the investigators. Mike came home, and nothing happened to him after that. The phone calls stopped, the surveillance stopped. It was just like somebody flipped a switch. But I'll never forget the final conversation that we had with the victim's mother. She thanked us for trying, and we told her that we believed her, that her son hadn't actually killed himself. Somewhere in that little border town, people know exactly what happened on that balcony, and they knew it well enough to make a private investigator disappear if he kept asking questions. Everybody seemed to be in on it. We walked away because we had to, and in all these years, I've never heard a single person from that town volunteer information about what took place. I've worked investigations long enough to know the difference between a dangerous case and a dangerous place, and this one was both. The case would start with a dead bar owner inside this small border town. Officially, he'd committed suicide, but unofficially, almost everyone who knew him thought that was nonsense. His mother hired our firm because she believed somebody had murdered her son and staged the scene. The basic story came together quickly. Two best friends owned a bar together, a businessman. The other had allegedly started moving drugs through the establishment for the cartel-connected traffickers. The good partner found out, confronted him, and shortly afterward ended up dead in his apartment balcony with a pistol in his hand. Now, I've worked on enough suspicious deaths to know that sometimes grieving families refuse to accept reality, but this didn't feel like one of those times. Sometimes death is just hard to accept for people. So the moment I arrive in town, people start acting very strange. Nobody wanted to talk for very long. People would agree to meet, then leave halfway through our conversation. Former employees would glance over their shoulder while I spoke, like they were expecting somebody to be standing behind me. The town itself wasn't that big. Everybody seemed to know everybody. More importantly, everybody seemed scared of somebody. The first thing that I noticed was this white pickup. Nothing special about it. The problem was that I kept seeing it outside my motel, across from the victim's apartment, parked near the bar. Maybe it's a coincidence, but in my line of work, those are few and far between. I start noticing the same faces appearing over and over as well. A guy smoking outside a pawn shop, a man reading a newspaper at a diner, somebody sitting in a parked car near my motel, never approaching me directly, but just always watching. The first real warning would come 3 days into my investigation. I returned to my motel room after interviewing a former employee. The door was still locked. Nothing appeared to be disturbed, but every file that I collected was now spread across my bed. Witness statements, photographs, financial records, everything, and neatly arranged too. Somebody had gone through all of it, and nothing was missing. And that's really weird in my line of work. Apparently, they just wanted me to know that they had access to everything that I collected so far. I reported to my office and then switched motels that night. The next morning, I found a folded newspaper under my windshield wiper. Inside was a photograph of the dead bar owner. Across his face, somebody had written, "Let it go, suicide." At that point, I probably should have left, but instead, I got stubborn. I'm old school. I don't lay down when I'm told to. One evening, I'm parked across from the bar and settled in for surveillance. The place was busy, music was drifting from inside while customers moved in and out. I'm scribbling notes when somebody taps on my passenger window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man was standing inches from the glass. What caught my attention about him wasn't him directly. It was the pistol that he used to bump the window. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at him. He stared back. No smile, no expression. Then he lowers his gun, turns around, walks away, and totally vanishes from my sight. I grabbed my camera and got out, but by the time I rounded the corner, the guy's gone. I called my office immediately, and my boss told me to be very careful. I told him I'm already past that point. I'm deep in water and need some kind of assistance. A few nights later, I stop at a payphone outside a grocery store to make my nightly report. Cell service here was pretty unreliable, and I wanted some privacy. I felt like my cell was compromised at this point. I was midway through updating the office when something exploded beside my head. Glass showered across the booth. A brick had crashed through the side panel. I stumbled backward and nearly dropped the receiver. Then a voice came from somewhere off in the darkness. "Go home." He had a Latino accent. That was it, just 2 words. Go home. I ran back toward my rental car and the parking lot was empty. The store had already closed and nobody else was around. I reached my car, yank open the door, and freeze. A folded piece of paper sat on the driver's seat. These people are good. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was my home address, not the hotel or the office, my actual home address where my wife lived. Whoever left it didn't need to explain that message. I understood perfectly. The next morning I called my boss, tell him everything, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he told me to come home. Immediately was the order. I'm not going to argue with him. And I guess that's the part people really don't understand about investigations. Movies will make it seem like we'll do anything for the cases we take on. Real life is very different. My life is not worth a paycheck, no matter how badly I want those answers. I packed my things, checked out of the motel, and drove north. Nobody followed me. Nobody contacted me. The moment I left town, everything stopped. Our firm handed every piece of information that we collected to law enforcement and withdrew from the case immediately. I never returned. And to this day, I do believe that man was murdered. I believe people in that town know exactly who did it. And I believe I got as close to the truth as I was ever going to get. When I found my wife's address sitting in the driver's seat of that rental car, I knew the investigation was over. Some truths are expensive, and this one almost cost me my family. Cold up here, at least there's no snow. I'm sitting in my office finishing up one of my previous cases. Just general reports left, lots of paperwork, boring stuff that seems to cause the world to drown in this cacophony of summer insects. The tedium is broken when my phone begins to ring. I pick it up, only to hear the voice of one of my closer PI friends on the other end. We chat casually for a few minutes, mostly me just trying to get my mind off the writing pains in my wrist, but it's obvious that he called me for a reason. He explains that he's been on this missing person case for a while now, a small boy around the age of 4. His mother and father had divorced a few years ago, and his mother is currently holed up here in the area. The boy has apparently been missing for quite some time now. The police have been contacted first, but they turned up nothing. After a week passes with no sign of a missing person, you kind of have to start assuming the worst. Nevertheless, we're usually the last resort for these kind of cases. So my buddy goes around asking, and apparently he manages to dig up a couple of accounts saying that the kid was seen boarding this olive green SUV with a woman looking to be in her early 30s, just hours before his disappearance was reported. Nobody thought to note the license plate apparently. His dad, my friend tells me, had left his son home alone for half an hour or so to run out for groceries. Why he didn't take his son along with him, I'll never know. At first, I thought it might be deliberate, like he had some kind of reason and done it on purpose. Of course, the human brain works weird sometimes, and dumb little human errors are always possibilities. I can only imagine the grief that must be felt after realizing one of those tiny bursts of idiocy might have caused something so heart-wrenching. Long story short, he matches the description of the woman. Short, mid-30s, long brown hair, overall rather average looking to a fair amount of other women. One sticks out though, the boy's mother. The child's father had been granted sole custody of the kid. Apparently the kid's mom had a little cabin out here which she would regularly visit and spend days worth of time in without alerting her husband, and whenever she was back home, she'd either be asleep or out somewhere. So my buddy says that he wants to team up with me for this one, split the pay. He's in a slightly larger town and the closest one to mine, but that's still a good 5-hour drive. Since he's got a few leads over on his end, he wants me to check out the mother, see if anything comes of that. It appears to me that at this point, the case is pretty cut and dry, so I accept his offer. He sends me the address and a picture of the kid and his mother. I finish up my paperwork before setting off. I drive around, semi-lost for a few minutes before I finally catch sight of the gravel road that breaks through a wall of bark created by the forest border. I glance down at my phone and sigh, placing it back into my pocket. Guess it was stupid to expect this to be on Google Maps. Now, I always despise having to go into the forest. As I begin to slowly pull down this path of towering green giants blotting out the sun overhead, I'm starting to slowly regret taking on this case. The gravel road slowly turns into dirt. The small break in the tree line slowly begins to disappear at my back. It's really dim out here. Dense pines doing a damn good job of casting this impenetrable veil of shade over the woods. Now, don't get me wrong, the Canadian Burrell forests, and this one is no exception, are stunningly beautiful. Birds chirp their cheerful tunes. Small rock faces jut out from the land like Mother Nature's own sculptures, and streams of sparkling clear water babble across the rocks into these cute little waterfalls, and occasionally picturesque lakes and rivers. But that's exactly why I hate these forests more than any other. More than anything, it always, without fail, seems like some horrible, sprightly facade. Like the entire forest is attempting to scrape this movie set together in order to offset the constant gnawing that I feel at the back of my neck and in the very core of my stomach whenever I come out here. These woods crawl with things and secrets and people that have no desire to be found. But by God, they'll take you with them and you'll never be seen again, just like this 4-year-old boy. The silhouette of a small building finally comes into my view off the horizon. So with a small sigh, I park my car and get out. As much as I'd love to stay cooped up in that metal haven of protection, I am here on a private investigation job. I do have to remain relatively covert, and that's not happening if a car just suddenly pulls up in the front lawn of your isolated cabin. As I get a little closer, I start to notice that something is a little off about the trees. I can't place exactly what that is, they just seem strange. The path eventually opens up into this small clearing, and a makeshift wooden gate is sitting at the end of the path. It's not stopping anybody as there are no walls on either side of it. Its only purpose seems to be presenting a tattered "No Trespassing" sign. Past the gate is the cabin itself. It looks to be in surprisingly good shape and from the outside appears rather modern. In front of it is a small patch of grass which acts as a parking space and a few areas in which it's been worn down by tires. The tracks leading right to the gate and to the path that I've just come down. Slowly but surely, my eyes drift up to the patch of grass to the car that's been parked in. My heart suddenly begins to dance around the mixture of joy and dread. Not surprisingly, it's an olive green SUV. I pull up my camera to my face and peer through the viewfinder. The SUV, the license plate. I snap a picture of each. Slowly but surely, the frame drifts over to the cabin. I snap a picture again. And it's this exact moment that I realize the front door has been wide open this entire time, and everything in my body turns to mush. I go quiet on instinct, the surrounding area suddenly feeling like it's been hit with this blast of cold air. And then I hear it, a faint humming coming from inside. It sounds soft, like a woman's voice. Once I hear it, I suddenly became unable to stop hearing it. It's a haunting, drifting tune, equal parts melodic and eerie. Every once in a while, it stops or skips a little bit, as if its source has ran out of breath or is having voice cracks. Before I really even knew what I was doing, I'm taking a step forward. I know it's a stupid idea, but my legs are moving faster than my mind is. Just a little peek, I tell myself. Just one peek to satiate my curiosity, and that's it. The cabin looms over me as I get closer. The grass crunches under my feet until finally, just barely, the inside of the building begins to come into view, and I stop. Branches. It takes a moment to register, but there are tree branches covering the floor. And when I say covering, I mean covering. These are not sticks. They are long, spindly, thin tree branches deliberately cut off their trunks. They're so thick that I can't see the real flooring beneath them. Is it carpet? Tile? There's not really any way to know for sure. Like a natural line, my gaze follows them to a single piece of furniture in the room, a small white coffee table and a CD player perched up on top. I now realize why the humming sounded like it was skipping. The trees around me suddenly feel like they're closing in on every side, like the earth below my feet is trying to swallow me whole. I don't take another moment to sit and deliberate on it. I just book it out of there as fast as I goddamn will myself. I launch towards my car, slam the door shut, and put it in reverse and punch it out of there. That place felt simply haunted. The first thing I did was contact the police, and I'm sure as hell not going back there, but there was no way I was just gonna let it sit there like that. They would eventually investigate and were just as weirded out as I was, but ultimately didn't turn up anything of use. The house was deserted, save for the sea of branches, the white coffee table, and the lone CD player. The SUV too was near pristine, not unlike a new car. Investigations continued for a while, but it was more or less a dead end. Nobody ever returned to the cabin, and my buddy's leads never really panned out either. The child's mother suddenly went missing as well. No, this isn't a fucked up joke. We never found any of them. In the end, things unfortunately had to be called off, and we never got to the bottom of it. The first thing that I learned about theft cases is that the money is usually the least interesting part. Most thieves are predictable. Every now and then, though, you run into somebody who steals with a method that makes no sense at all, and these are actually kind of fun to investigate. This case came from a business owner named Hal who ran a shipping and print shop in a small strip complex. For about 6 months, money had been disappearing from the safe every week or two. Not thousands of dollars, a couple of hundred at a time, just enough to take notice of. The strange part was that nobody could figure out how it was happening though. The safe wasn't damaged, the doors weren't forced, the alarm never went off. Hal changed the code multiple times, installed a camera, and even spent several nights hiding in the back room waiting for the thief to appear, but nobody ever showed up. Yet every week or so, more money would vanish. By the time he called us, he was exhausted. He walked us through the shop, pointing out the safe, the camera, the back door, and every place that he'd already checked. He was convinced someone had been using a key or had inside access. That led us to a former employee named Rob. Rob had worked there for years and had been fired a couple of months earlier after a series of arguments with Hal. He knew the business, he knew the routines, and at one point had known the safe code itself, so on paper, he seemed to be the obvious suspect, right? When we interviewed him though, the story would start falling apart. Several theft dates lined up with the overnight shifts at his new job. Others lined up with family obligations that were very easy to verify. More importantly, he seemed genuinely confused by the amount being stolen. $200? He asked. If I was risking jail time, I think I'd take a little more than that. I'd empty the damn safe. And to his credit, that was a fair point. Whoever was doing this wasn't emptying the safe. They were just taking enough to get by before disappearing again. It felt much less like a major theft operation and more like somebody trying to be nonchalant. After Rob's alibi checked out, we widened the investigation. We looked at neighboring businesses, current employees, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, and anybody else with regular access to the complex, but none of it stood out. The alarm logs were clean, the doors were secure, the camera never showed anybody entering the room. The entire thing began to feel impossible. So we decided to stop looking at the obvious entry points. We left Hal's original camera exactly where it was and installed 2 additional hidden cameras. One was concealed inside an old printer on a shelf facing the safe. The other was hidden near the ceiling with a wider view of the room. We duplicated the feed from the original camera and then waited. Nothing happened on the first night and nothing happened on the second. But on the third, my phone buzzed a little after 3 a.m. I opened up the live feed and to my surprise saw some movement. One of the ceiling tiles was lifting up. Slowly, a hand emerged from the darkness above. It held a piece of cloth. The hand reached down and carefully draped the cloth over Hal's visible camera. The screen from that camera would go dark, but our hidden cameras kept recording. I called my partner, Hal, and the police while watching the feed. A folding ladder then began descending from the ceiling. A man climbed down, and I couldn't believe that I was actually watching this in real time, and there was nothing to it. No mastermind villainy, barely any nuance at all. And I recognized him almost immediately. He was a local driver who spent most of his time around the bus stop and drainage wash near the complex. I'd seen him dozens of times over the years now. He looked rough, but he wasn't acting rough. Everything he did was very gentle and practiced. He climbed down the ladder, walked directly to the safe, and entered the code without hesitation. The safe opened to his touch. He then removed a small stack of cash, closed the safe, wiped his fingerprints from the handle, and headed back toward the ladder. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes. By the time the police had actually arrived, he was gone. The ceiling tile was back in place, and the ladder had disappeared. There wasn't a single sign visibly anywhere that anybody had ever been in the room. Police would search the business and quickly discovered tracks inside the crawl space above the ceiling. Once they started following them, the entire mystery would unravel. That crawl space connected most of the businesses inside the complex. Above Hal's safe were flattened areas in the insulation where somebody had obviously spent a long period of time lying on their stomach and waiting. A loose board was eventually found nearly 100 meters away from another business, hidden behind pallets and utility equipment. It provided access to the structure. From there, somebody could crawl through the service area and enter the ceiling space above multiple stores. As more businesses were questioned, a pattern would emerge. Missing cash, missing cigarettes and liquor, missing prescription medication. Again, just like Hal's store, nothing dramatic enough to trigger a major investigation, but enough to reveal that somebody had been quietly stealing from the entire complex for months now. The only question left was how he learned Hal's safe code. Our best guess was pretty simple. He'd been watching from above. At some point, he'd likely observed Hal entering the code and just memorized it. But it was a disturbing thought though. While Hal sat below counting money, locking up and changing combinations, somebody may have been lying just a few feet above his head, watching him do everything. The police found the man's camp in a nearby drainage wash later on that day. They recovered stolen property and evidence connecting him to multiple thefts, but the man himself was gone. For the next few days, everybody in the complex was on edge. Employees kept looking at ceiling tiles. Owners started checking attics and crawl spaces. Several businesses requested security upgrades. We knew he was around, and nobody liked the idea that somebody had been living above them for months now. 3 days later, the chase would finally end. A patrol officer spotted the suspect behind the strip complex and tried to stop him, and instead, he ran. My partner and I happened to be sitting nearby with Hal when we heard shouting from outside. We stepped into the alley just in time to see the suspect sprinting away from 2 officers. Despite looking half-starved, the guy was fast. He cleared a fence and then cut through a service corridor and disappeared behind a stack of pallets. Officers pursued him while additional units moved in from the opposite side. For several minutes, all we could hear was shouting, crashing metal, and radio traffic. Then the suspect burst out from behind the laundromat. One officer intercepted him, a big old bloke, head and shoulders over the rest of us. The man pulled a screwdriver and lunged. The attack wasn't sophisticated like his stealing procedures, it was feral. The officer would avoid most of it, and though his sleeve was torn open in the struggle. A second officer hit the suspect from the side, and then all 3 men went down hard on the pavement. Even on the ground, the suspect kept fighting. He kicked, twisted, and tried to crawl away, and it took multiple officers to finally get him restrained and into handcuffs. When they brought him back past us, Hal stepped forward. "How did you know the code?" he asked, and the suspect looked at him for a moment and then smiled. He leaned forward and whispered something, and Hal's face went pale. Later, I asked him what the man had said to him, and at first he didn't really want to answer me. Finally, he told me. He said he should have killed me. And that was that. The man eventually was charged and connected to multiple thefts throughout that complex. The mystery was solved, but it never really felt particularly satisfying. Most theft cases end when you catch the thief, and this one ended with everybody realizing how close he'd been to them the entire time. There were other issues to worry about, like a total lack of building security. Hal would eventually replace the cameras, the ceilings, the locks, and eventually the safe itself. He stopped staying late alone too, and stopped keeping so much cash on hand. I don't really blame him. You never really know who might be hiding and waiting for you to leave. Most missing person cases have 1,000 theories. By the time a client walks into a private investigator's office, they've usually spent weeks and weeks building up a story in their head about what they think happened. Sometimes they are right, but most of the time they're not. And this case started with a daughter who was convinced an old man had been taken advantage of. Her father, Harold, was a 78-year-old man and lived alone inside a retirement community about an hour outside the city. He was healthy enough to drive, sharp enough to manage his own affairs, and stubborn enough that nobody worried about him too much. Then one morning he simply vanishes. His car's gone, his phone was turned off. Nobody had heard from him in nearly 3 weeks. He had scattered family in the area, and lots of them were longtime friends. The police would look into it, but weren't treating it as very suspicious. There was no signs of violence, no financial crimes, no evidence he'd been forced to go anywhere. At best, they would issue a silver alert and assume that he was just missing due to some kind of confusion. But his daughter disagreed. She slid a photograph across my desk, and it showed Harold sitting in an outdoor cafe beside a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. "I think that's her," she said. "Who?" "The woman who took him." According to several people at the retirement community, Harold had developed a routine. Every Tuesday morning for nearly a year, he drove to the same diner 30 minutes away. Nobody knew why. He never talked about it. He'd disappear for a couple of hours and then come back in a noticeably better mood. After his disappearance, people would start talking. Somebody remembered seeing him with a woman. Another claimed they'd overheard an argument, and a third swore that she'd seen the woman driving Harold's car months earlier. By the time the rumors would reach his daughter, they had transformed into this darker story. A younger woman had manipulated an old lonely man, drained his savings that would eventually make him disappear. The diner was my first stop, and the waitress recognized Harold immediately. "Every Tuesday," she said. "Were they close?" She laughed. Close isn't the word I'd use." "What word would you use then?" She thought for a moment and then said, "Infatuated." That answer surprised me. According to her, the pair would sit in the same booth for hours. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes one of them would be crying. Sometimes they just sat in complete silence, but there was never any physical affection, no hand-holding, no flirting, nothing romantic at all. "It always felt like they were trying to figure something out," the waitress said, and that answer only deepened this whole mystery. Over the next few days, I tracked down security footage, reviewed bank records, and followed every lead I could find. The woman appeared everywhere Harold did: gas stations, bookstores, parks, and the diner. Yet, I couldn't find a single indication why she benefited financially from knowing this guy. There was no transfers, there was no gifts, no suspicious withdrawals. If she was running some kind of scam, she was really terrible at it. Then I found something that would change the entire case. Inside a filing cabinet at Harold's home was this old envelope hidden behind decades of paperwork. The letter inside was more than 40 years old. It had been opened but carefully preserved. The first page was from a woman Harold had dated once. She informed him that she was pregnant. The second page was Harold's response. It was an apology and a promise to help and a request to meet. The letter had apparently never been mailed. Suddenly now I have a new theory. Finding the woman took another week. When I finally sat down across from her, I noticed the resemblance immediately. the eyes, the smile, the shape of her face. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make sense once you saw it. She listened quietly while I explained why I was there. Then she nodded. I wondered when somebody would find me. What was your relationship with Harold? For a moment, I thought she was going to cry, but instead, she smiled at me. I'm his daughter. According to her, she spent most of her life believing her biological father wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother had died years earlier, and while sorting through old documents after her death, she discovered Harold's name and eventually tracked him down. When she made contact, she expected rejection. Instead, Harold was devastated. The letter I'd found had never been mailed because he'd been sent overseas shortly after writing it. By the time he returned, both mother and child had disappeared. He spent decades believing they wanted nothing to do with him. She spent decades believing he had abandoned her. Two lives shaped by the same misunderstanding. But there's still one question left. Where is he? Her smile grew. 6 months before his disappearance, Harold had been diagnosed with an aggressive illness. He'd kept it secret from almost everybody. The only person he would tell was the daughter that he recently found. After years of missed birthdays, missed holidays, and missed opportunities, he'd made a decision. He sold his house, left the retirement community, and moved to a small town near where she lived. The reason nobody could find him wasn't because he'd been murdered or manipulated. It was because he had finally found the family he thought he'd lost for forever. A few days later, I met Harold myself. He looked a lot thinner than the photographs, but happier than any missing person I'd ever located. As I left, I watched him and his daughter sitting together on a porch swing, talking quietly as the sun disappeared between the trees. I've worked many cases involving fraud, violence, disappearances, and betrayal. This one was different, very real, albeit secret, even touching. Perhaps, I know it wasn't dangerous, but it began strange and became stranger, right to the very end.